Now, let's say your business idea does involve, tooling up a $10 million factory. Okay. That's a huge investment. That's a huge cost that's upfront. You've got to spend it before you start making anything.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you deal with that? I mean, it's a really big cost.
Right.
And it looks like, and the reality is you're in the hole a lot before you ever get started. But how do you account for that? Is that overhead? Well, some of it the operations of it may be overhead. But actually you can treat huge investments like that in your value creation or your value delivery process almost as a variable cost. And that's a process called amortization. Okay. So let's say, think of Nintendo. Nintendo has a factory that is designed to create Nintendo Wiis. That's what they do. Okay. And the equipment that it takes
to build them
is really expensive.
Yeah, I'm sure.
In the at least easily the tens of millions, if not the hundreds.
Wow.
Okay. Now, a way of accounting for that is, okay, you build up this factory. How many Wiis do you expect that line to make?
Right.
Okay. And the more that it's capable of making, you can actually divide the total cost of the factory by the number of units that you intend to create.
Right.
And that's what's called an amortization. You're spreading the cost of that investment along all of the units.
Yeah.
And then so, it may be that, the factory itself accounts for $5 of the cost of every Wii. And you can start to imagine, margins and all of those things based on that.
Yeah, I like doing that when I buy shoes.
Right. So
much better.
how much do the shoes cost?
It's only going to cost like 50 cents a day.
Exactly.
I love doing that.
All right. Which is actually a very useful thing to think about.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly if it requires a massive upfront investment. You can start to figure out, okay, it's only a portion of the total cost.
Right.
And this capability is going to allow us to build this thing that we can sell for a lot more.
Makes sense.
Now, the tricky thing about amortization.
You gotta guess right, too.
You gotta guess right, okay? We're relying on some prediction, or we're relying on some forecasting here. And we'll talk about this a great deal in systems. Okay. Prediction and forecasting is notoriously tricky business. Long story short, you can't do it well. You can make assumptions, you can build scenarios, you can do all sorts of things to try to alleviate your risk here. But the thing is, you don't know how many Nintendo Wiis you're going to get out of this factory.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're going to amortize something, do it conservatively.
Okay.
But it helps in the financial planning of all of these things because instead of just being, well, we're in the whole $10 million now, and now we have to dig ourselves out.
Right.
Because this factory is a force multiplier, which we talked about earlier. It's giving you a capability to do something that you previously were not able to do. And if you amortize a force multiplier, you can account for it in a different way that you can actually figure out, is it worth it for us to spend this amount to have this capability do this or not? And so, it's if the prediction part breaks down, that's where amortization can run, and you can run into some very tricky things.
Oh, yeah.
Because, let's say...
Because you can't pay like $600 per Wii for the factory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's... And if so for example, if the factory breaks down and you can only create half as many as you thought you could.
It's twice as expensive.
Or, and this is actually something that happened to Crocs. The weird...
Oh, this is a sad story.
The funky little...
Shoe. The rubber shoes.
Yeah, the ugly ones.
I've heard they're comfy, though.
Yeah. Well, what they did is their early sales were really good. They tooled up this factory to meet demand that they thought was going to be there. It ended up being a fad, so they were only in demand for anywhere between 6 months to a year, depending on location, and then demand dried up.
Well, and the reason they found that is because people didn't really need more than one pair. So even if people kept wearing them, you don't need two pairs of not quite in fashion,
ugly
super
rubber
comfy shoes. Right. You really just need one pair.
Right. And so what happened is the company created millions of pairs of these things.
And went totally in the hole, even though at that time they were selling like gangbusters because nobody needed more.
Right. So they essentially predicted that the demand that they were currently experiencing was going to continue if not go up. And they tooled up in order to be able to meet that demand, and then demand dried up.
Yeah.
So, we'll talk about prediction and forecasting in great detail in the systems chapter. But the thing is, amortization relies on your ability to sell and to predict demand. And it's a problem that every business who tries to do this faces, from the largest company to the smallest company. If you tool up too much, then you may not be able to amortize correctly. Things may be more expensive than you assumed that they would be. If you don't tool up enough, then you have a ton of customers who want what you've got, and you can't sell it to them. Which is a very real cost. You're losing money by not being able to fulfill demand that is there.
And that actually, speaking of shoes, happened to Chacos this year because they, I guess, moved their manufacturing and they couldn't get it going quickly enough, and so they lost a ton of business at the end of the year.
Yes. So this is one of those aspects of business that is very much a middle path. I mean, you want to have enough capacity to fill demand, but not so much capacity that you're spending a lot to, fulfill orders that aren't there.
Yeah.
And it relies on prediction, which is notoriously tricky business. So there is no real good answer to this. It's very much an experimentation. It's very much a try to do things smartly, and if you err on the side of not overextending yourself.
And try to know your customer as well as you can. That's probably the best way to guess,
Yeah, and that's pretty much the only thing you can do.
Yeah.
So amortization from a financial standpoint is very helpful because it allows you to split the cost of something expensive over the lifetime of its use. But it's also very tricky because if the lifetime of its use is different from what you expect it to be, your calculations turn out to be quite different. So use it appropriately, but be careful because it can also bite you if you use it improperly.